She was dying in the desert, running from a marriage that was slowly killing her soul, when a mysterious warrior found her collapsed in the sand. What happened next changed everything she thought she knew about love. This woman discovered that sometimes you have to lose everything to find who you really are. If you're ready for a story about second chances and finding love in the most unexpected places, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from right now. Let's dive into this incredible journey together. The desert stretched before her like an ocean of amber glass, its surface rippling with heat waves that distorted reality until she could no longer distinguish between memory and mirage. Sarah's feet had long since stopped feeling the burn of hot sand through her torn sneakers. The wedding dress she wore, once pristine white satin, now hung in tatters, stained with dust and the salt of desperate tears. She had been walking for hours, perhaps days. Time had become as fluid as the shifting dunes around her, each step a prayer whispered to a sky that offered no mercy. The silver locket at her throat, the only thing of her mother's she had managed to keep, bounced against her collarbone with each labored breath. Inside it, a faded photograph of a woman with kind eyes, eyes that Sarah had inherited, though hers now held a haunted quality her mother's never had. Behind her lay the wreckage of a life she had tried so hard to make work. The bruises on her wrists had faded to yellow shadows, but the invisible ones ran deeper, threading through her soul like fractures in glass. David's voice still echoed. In her mind, promising things would be different, that he loved her, that she deserved what happened when she didn't listen. The sun was a cruel master, painting the world in shades of gold and copper that might have been beautiful if they weren't, slowly killing her. Sarah's lips cracked as she tried to swallow, her throat raw from calling out to an empty landscape that swallowed sound like water absorbing light. She stumbled, her knees hitting the burning sand, and for a moment considered simply lying down and letting the desert take her. It would be easier than the alternative, going back, explaining, pretending that everything was fine when her world had shattered like pottery dropped on stone. But something in her rebelled against surrender. Perhaps it was her mother's voice, soft as morning light, telling her bedtime stories about brave women who walked through fire and emerged transformed. Perhaps it was simply the stubborn thread of hope that refused to be cut, no matter how sharp the blade. Sarah pushed herself to her feet, her vision blurring at the edges. The horizon wavered like a dream remembered upon waking, and she fixed her gaze on a distant mesa that seemed to promise shelter, though she knew it was likely another cruel trick of the light, one foot in front of the other. That was all she could manage now, one breath, then another. The locket bumped against her chest, a small anchor to a time when the world had made sense, when love didn't come with conditions written in bruises. The dress caught on a thorny shrub, tearing further, and Sarah didn't even pause to free it properly. Let it fall apart. Let everything fall apart. She would walk until she couldn't, and then perhaps the desert would teach her something about endurance that her marriage never had. The world tilted sideways, and Sarah found herself on her knees again, this time unable to rise. The sand felt surprisingly cool against her palms, or perhaps her body temperature had climbed so high that nothing felt hot anymore. Her vision fractured into kaleidoscope fragments, blue sky, golden earth, the sun's merciless eye watching her surrender. She closed her eyes and let herself fall forward, her cheek meeting the gritty warmth of the desert floor. Somewhere in the distance she thought she heard thunder, though the sky had been clear for days. The sound grew closer, rhythmic, like a heartbeat made manifest in the world. Hoofbeats. Sarah tried to lift her head, but found her neck had become a thing of rubber and whispers. The sound circled her, and she felt, rather than saw, a presence, dismounting nearby, boots on sand soft as sighs. A shadow fell across her closed eyelids, blessing her with momentary coolness. "Easy," a voice said, and it was nothing like David's voice, no sharp edges, no undertone of threat. This voice carried the weight of mountains, steady and sure as stone. "You're safe now." Hands touched her shoulders, careful as prayer, and she flinched despite her exhaustion. But these hands didn't grip or demand. They simply offered support as she was lifted into a sitting position. A water bottle appeared at her lips, and she drank greedily, too desperate to be cautious. Slowly, the voice counseled, and she obeyed, though every cell in her body screamed for more. Through her tangled hair, she caught glimpses of her rescuer. Dark skin weathered by sun and wind, black hair pulled back, clothing that spoke of practical comfort rather than fashion. But it was his eyes that held her, deep brown, patient as earth, holding no judgment for the broken woman in a ruined wedding dress who had nearly died in his desert. "My name is Joe," he said, and even his name felt solid, dependable. "Joe Yazzie, can you tell me yours?" "Sarah," she whispered, her voice a dried leaf crumbling. "Sarah." She almost gave her married name, then stopped. That woman, Mrs. Sarah Morrison, had died somewhere back in the dunes. The woman sitting here, drinking water like it was salvation itself, was someone else entirely. "Just Sarah," she finished. He nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Can you ride?" The question was practical, without judgment, and Sarah found herself nodding before she was certain it was true. Joe helped her to her feet with the same careful attention he might show a wounded bird, and she found herself looking at a horse that seemed to have stepped out of a dream, a paint mare with intelligent eyes and a coat marked in patches of brown and white like abstract art. "This is Luna," Joe said, stroking the horse's neck. "She's gentle." He helped Sarah mount, then swung up behind her with fluid grace. The horse began to move, and Sarah found herself surrounded by warmth. Joe's chest against her back, his arms creating a loose circle around her as he held the reins. For the first time in months, she felt safe. "Where are we going?" she asked, surprised by her own curiosity. "Home," he replied simply, as if the word held all the answers she might ever need. Sarah woke to voices speaking in a language that flowed like water over stones, melodic and incomprehensible. The sounds wrapped around her consciousness like a gentle tide, pulling her from dreams of endless sand and burning sun into a reality that felt impossibly soft. She lay on something that wasn't sand, a bed, she realized, with actual pillows and blankets that smelled of sage and cedar. The air around her was cooler, perfumed with wood smoke, and something cooking that made her stomach clench with sudden hunger. Opening her eyes revealed a ceiling of logs and rough-hewn beams, and beyond that walls hung with woven blankets in patterns that seemed to tell stories in geometric languages she couldn't read. A small window let in honey-colored light that painted everything with warmth. "You're awake." Sarah turned toward the voice and found an elderly woman sitting in a chair nearby, her hands busy with what appeared to be beadwork. Her hair was silver-white, braided and wound in a complex style, and her face held the kind of weathered beauty that spoke of decades spent in honest relationship with sun and earth. "I'm Maria," the woman said, setting aside her work. "Joe's grandmother, and you, child, have been sleeping for 2 days." 2 days. Sarah sat up slowly, her head spinning slightly, and realized she was wearing clothes that weren't her own. Simple cotton dress in soft blue, comfortable and loose. "My dress being cleaned," Maria said gently, "though I suspect you won't want it back." There was no judgment in the statement, only understanding that settled around Sarah like a familiar shawl. She looked down at her hands, clean now, the dirt scrubbed away, though the thin white line around her ring finger still showed where her wedding band had been. She had thrown it away somewhere in the desert, a small act of rebellion that had felt enormous at the time. "Where am I?" "The Yazzie place," Maria replied, rising to check something in a pot that hung over a small fire. "About 20 miles from where Joe found you. You picked a good direction to walk. Another few miles and you would have been in the sacred mountains, harder to find there." Sarah accepted a bowl of something that smelled like heaven, a stew rich with meat and vegetables and spices that warmed her from the inside out. She ate in silence while Maria returned to her beadwork, her fingers moving with practiced precision over tiny glass beads in shades of turquoise and coral. "Joe told me you were running from something," Maria said after a while, not looking up from her work. "We don't need to know what. The desert keeps its own counsel about such things." "Why are you helping me?" Sarah asked, the question emerging from some deep well of confusion. In her experience, kindness always came with a price. Maria's hand stilled, and she looked up with eyes that held depth Sarah hadn't expected. "Because that's what people do," she said simply. "When someone is lost, you help them find their way." The simplicity of it was almost heartbreaking. No conditions, no expectations, no demands for gratitude or explanation. Just the basic human acknowledgement that suffering should be met with compassion. Outside, Sarah could hear more voices, children playing, adults calling to each other in both English and what she assumed was Navajo. It sounded like community, like belonging, like all the things she had been searching for without knowing their names. "Rest," Maria said, noting Sarah's heavy eyelids. "Healing takes time." On her third day among the Yazzie family, Sarah ventured outside for the first time. The compound, for lack of a better word, consisted of several modest homes scattered around a central area, where children played and adults went about the business of daily life. So everything felt unhurried, purposeful, connected to rhythms older than clocks. Joe appeared at her side as she stood uncertainly on Maria's doorstep, as if he had been waiting for this moment. He wore work clothes, jeans and a flannel shirt, with sleeves rolled up, but there was something about the way he carried himself that suggested comfort with ceremony, as well as everyday tasks. "Would you like to see the horses?" he asked. And Sarah nodded, grateful for a destination that didn't require explanation. They walked in comfortable silence across hard-packed earth, past gardens where corn and squash grew in neat rows, past a workshop where the sound of hammering suggested someone building or repairing. Children looked up from their games to wave. At Joe, their faces curious but not intrusive when they saw Sarah. The horses grazed in a large corral, perhaps a dozen of them in various colors and conformations. Luna, the paint mare who had carried Sarah to safety, lifted her head and nickered when she saw Joe approaching. "She likes you," Joe said, as Luna came to the fence, clearly hoping for attention. "How can you tell?" "Horses don't lie," he replied, offering his palm for the mare to sniff. "They see who you really are underneath everything else." Sarah watched him interact with the animal, noting the quiet confidence in his movements, the way Luna relaxed into his touch. There was no dominance in it, no need to prove anything. Just communication between two beings who understood each other's language. "I used to ride," Sarah said suddenly, surprising herself. "When I was younger, before—" She stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence. "Before what?" "Before I forgot who I was." Joe's hands stilled on Luna's neck, and he looked at Sarah with those patient brown eyes. "Maybe you didn't forget. Maybe you just got buried under things that weren't really you." The observation hit her like cool water on burned skin. She had spent so many years adapting, accommodating, becoming smaller and smaller, until she fit into the space David thought she should occupy. But standing here in the desert air, wearing borrowed clothes and watching a man who moved through the world without apology, she felt something stirring that might have been her original self. "Would you like to brush her?" Joe asked, producing a soft brush from somewhere. Sarah took it, her fingers remembering the feel of grooming tools from childhood lessons she hadn't thought about in years. Luna stood patiently as Sarah worked, the repetitive motion soothing something deep in her chest that had been knotted for so long she'd forgotten it could relax. "She was my wife's horse," Joe said quietly, and Sarah's hands stilled. "Elena, she died 3 years ago. Cancer." The words hung in the desert air like prayers, heavy with loss, but somehow not bitter. Sarah resumed brushing, understanding now why Joe's movements held such gentleness. He was a man who had loved deeply and lost greatly, yet somehow still found room for kindness toward strangers. "I'm sorry," she said, inadequate words for vast grief. "She would have liked you," Joe replied. "She always said the desert brings people what they need, even when they don't know they need it." Sarah discovered that the Yazzie household operated on rhythms entirely foreign to her previous life. There were no rigid schedules, no demands for productivity, no constant rush towards somewhere else. Instead, time moved like water, finding its level, each day shaped by necessity, weather, and the quiet accumulation of small meaningful acts. She began helping Maria with simple tasks, sorting beans, chopping vegetables, grinding corn into meal using traditional tools that felt substantial in her hands. Her palms blistered at first, then developed calluses that spoke of honest work, honestly done. "You learn quickly," Maria observed one morning as Sarah worked steadily at the metate, the ancient grinding stone smoothed beneath her palms. "I like having something useful to do," Sarah replied, and realized it was true. At David's house she had been ornamental, dressed appropriately, speaking when spoken to, existing primarily to reflect well on his success. Here her efforts contributed to something larger than appearance. Joe appeared in the doorway, and Maria gestured him inside with the easy authority of someone accustomed to managing family dynamics. He accepted a cup of coffee and settled into a chair that seemed molded to his form by years of use. "The Corn Harvest Festival is next week," he said to no one in particular, though his eyes found Sarah. "There will be visitors, people from other families, some from town." Sarah's hand stilled on the grinding stone. "Should I—" She started to ask if she should hide, make herself scarce, disappear until the danger of social interaction had passed. But Maria's warm hand covered hers, steadying both her motions and her anxiety. "You should come," Maria said firmly, "if you want to." The invitation was offered without pressure, but Sarah felt the weight of it nonetheless. To attend would be to step out of the protective bubble that had surrounded her since her arrival, to risk being seen and questioned, and possibly judged. But to decline would be to remain hidden, and she was beginning to understand that hiding might be another form of dying. "I don't have anything appropriate to wear," she said, grasping at practical concerns. Maria's eyes crinkled with something that might have been mischief. "I might have something that would work." She disappeared into a back room and returned, with a garment that made Sarah's breath catch. It was a traditional dress in deep turquoise velvet, decorated with silver conchos and intricate beadwork that caught the light like captured stars. The craftsmanship was exquisite, clearly made by hands that understood both beauty and meaning. "This was Eleanor's," Joe said quietly. "She would want it worn again." Sarah looked between them, seeing the gift being offered, not just the dress, but acceptance, inclusion, the chance to belong somewhere for the space of an evening. "I couldn't—" "You could," Maria interrupted gently, "if you choose to." That afternoon, Sarah tried on the dress in the privacy of the small room that had become hers. It fit as if made for her body, the velvet soft against her skin, the silver warm with the memory of another woman's life. Looking at herself in the small mirror Maria had provided, Sarah saw someone she barely recognized, not the frightened refugee who had stumbled out of the desert, not the diminished wife who had lived in David's shadow, but someone entirely new, someone who might be worth saving. The evening before the festival, Sarah found Joe sitting alone near the horse corral, his face tilted toward a sky full of stars that seemed close enough to touch. She had been unable to sleep, her mind cycling through anxieties about the coming celebration, about meeting new people, about the possibility that someone might recognize her and drag her back to a life she had risked everything to escape. "Mind if I sit?" she asked, and he gestured to a wooden bench that faced the desert. They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the desert, coyotes calling in the distance, the soft snuffling of horses, the whisper of wind through sage. Sarah pulled Maria's shawl closer around her shoulders, grateful for its warmth and the sense of protection it offered. "Nervous about tomorrow?" Joe asked eventually. "Terrified," Sarah admitted, finding honesty easier in the darkness. "I'm not good with people anymore. I've forgotten how to be around them without apologizing for existing." Joe was quiet for so long that Sarah began to wonder if she had said too much, revealed more brokenness than anyone should be expected to handle. But when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of shared understanding. "After Elena died, I couldn't be around people for almost a year," he said. "Everyone wanted to help, to feed me, to tell me how she was in a better place. But all I could think about was how I failed to protect her from something that was eating her alive from the inside." Sarah turned to look at him, seeing the profile of his face outlined by starlight. "You couldn't have prevented cancer." "Logic and grief don't always speak the same language," he replied. "I knew that, but knowing didn't make the guilt go away. I thought if I just stayed away from everyone, I couldn't fail anyone else." "What changed?" Joe was quiet again, his hands folded in his lap. "Maria. She just kept showing up, bringing food, sitting with me, not trying to fix anything, just being there until I remembered that being alone isn't the same as being safe." Sarah felt something loosen in her chest, a knot she hadn't even realized was there. "Is that what you're doing with me? Just being there?" "Maybe," he said, and there was something almost shy in his voice. "Or maybe you're doing it for me." Maria says the desert brings people what they need, even when they don't know they need it. The observation hung between them like a bridge across dark water. Sarah found herself thinking about the moment she had decided to walk into the desert. Rather than return to David's house, how it had felt less like running away than like walking toward something she couldn't yet name. "The man you ran from," Joe said carefully, "was he?" "He never hit me," Sarah said quickly, then stopped, recognizing the automatic defense for what it was. "Not exactly, but he made me feel like I was disappearing, piece by piece, until there was almost nothing left." Joe nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Some wounds don't show on the skin." "Eleanor was lucky to have someone who loved her like you did," Sarah said. "We were both lucky," Joe replied. "That's the thing about love. It doesn't make you smaller. Real love makes you more yourself, not less." Sarah thought about David's version of love, all conditions and expectations and subtle punishments for failing to meet impossible standards. Then she thought about the way Joe's love for his late wife still moved through him like light through water, transforming everything it touched without demanding ownership. "I don't know if I remember how to be myself," she confessed. "Maybe tomorrow you'll remember a little bit," Joe said gently, "and maybe that will be enough." The festival transformed the Yazzie compound into something magical. Colorful banners fluttered from lines stretched between trees, long tables groaned under the weight of traditional foods, and the air vibrated with music that seemed to rise from the earth itself, drums and flutes and voices joining in songs older than memory. Sarah stood in the doorway of Maria's house, wearing Elena's turquoise dress, feeling like an imposter dressed as someone worthy of celebration. But Maria appeared at her elbow, solid and reassuring, offering an arm for support. "Breathe," Maria advised. "Everyone here understands about new beginnings." They moved together into the crowd, and Sarah was surprised by the warmth of her reception. No one stared or asked intrusive questions. Instead, she was simply included, introduced as Sarah, who's staying with us for a while, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. An elderly man named Thomas, whose hands were gnarled by arthritis but whose eyes sparkled with humor, told her stories about the horses while they ate fry bread and mutton stew. A woman named Janet, mother of 3 teenagers who had inherited. Her easy laugh asked Sarah's advice about a quilt pattern as if her opinion mattered. But it was the children who claimed her most completely. They appeared at her side like desert flowers after rain, drawn by some instinct that recognized kindness. A little girl named Ayana braided tiny wildflowers into Sarah's hair while chattering about her pet rabbit. 2 boys demonstrated their skill with traditional games, clearly hoping to impress the pretty visitor in the beautiful dress. "You're good with them," Joe observed, appearing with a plate of food for her. Sarah looked down at Ayana, who had fallen asleep against her side during a particularly long song, and felt something shift in her chest like tectonic plates finding new alignment. "They're not afraid of me." "Why would they be?" "Because I'm broken," Sarah said simply. "Children usually sense that." "Maybe they sense that you're healing," Joe replied. "That's different than being broken." As the evening progressed, Sarah found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't thought possible. When the traditional dances began, she watched from the sidelines, mesmerized by the intricate steps and the stories they told through movement. The dancers wore regalia that spoke of generations of careful craftsmanship, feathers and beadwork, and silver jewelry that caught the firelight like captured stars. "It's beautiful," she murmured to Joe, who stood beside her. Elena used to dance, he said. She said it was like praying with your whole body. Would you teach me? The words escaped before Sarah could stop them, surprising them both. Joe looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. Are you sure? Instead of answering, Sarah held out her hand. After a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, Joe took it, leading her to the edge of the dancing area where other couples moved in rhythm with the drums. The dance was simple enough for a beginner, mostly stepping and swaying, following the heartbeat of the music. But as Joe's hands guided her through the movements, Sarah felt something awakening that had been dormant for so long she'd forgotten it existed. Joy. Pure, uncomplicated joy at the simple act of moving through space with another person who asked. Nothing of her except presence. The song ended, and Sarah found herself breathless, laughing, more alive than she had felt in years. Joe was smiling too, the first real smile she had seen from him, and she realized they were still holding hands. Thank you, she said, though the words felt inadequate for what had just passed between them. Thank you, he replied, and she understood that gratitude could flow both ways, that healing was sometimes a collaborative art. In the days following the festival, Sarah found herself drawn into the deeper rhythms of Yazzie family life. Maria began teaching her traditional crafts, beadwork that required patience and precision, weaving that connected her to generations of women who had worked these same patterns. Every design tells a story, Maria explained, as Sarah struggled with her first attempt at a simple bracelet. This one represents the journey between earth and sky. See how the pattern moves upward but always returns to the center. Sarah studied the beadwork, beginning to see how the geometric forms might represent more than simple decoration. What story should mine tell? That's for you to decide, Maria replied. But perhaps start with where you are now rather than where you've been. The advice resonated beyond beadwork. Sarah began to notice how the Yazzie family lived their values, rather than simply speaking them. Respect for elders wasn't an abstract concept, but a daily practice evidenced in how Joe deferred to Maria's wisdom, how the younger family members sought her guidance before making decisions. Connection to the land wasn't philosophical, but practical. Water used sparingly because the desert demanded conservation, food grown and preserved with understanding of seasonal cycles, animals treated as partners rather than possessions. Joe began including Sarah in his daily routines, teaching her about the horses, showing her how to read weather patterns in cloud formations, sharing the names of plants and their traditional uses. He was a natural teacher, patient and encouraging, never making her feel ignorant for not knowing things that seemed second nature to him. "This is Osha," he said one morning, pointing out a plant during their walk to check on the horses. "Good for headaches and stomach troubles. My grandmother used to say it was the medicine for people who think too much." Sarah smiled, recognizing herself in the description. "Is that your polite way of telling me I overthink things? Is that your polite way of asking for some Osha tea?" The easy banter felt like a minor miracle. When had she last been able to joke with someone without fear of saying the wrong thing? David had trained her to analyze every word before speaking, to anticipate his reactions and adjust accordingly. With Joe, conversation felt like dancing, natural, spontaneous, mutually supportive. One evening, as they sat outside Maria's house watching the sunset paint the desert in impossible colors, Joe began telling her stories from his childhood. Tales of his grandfather, who had been a code talker in World War II. Stories of his father, who had worked to preserve traditional language and customs while navigating the modern world. Memories of Eleanor, who had taught children at the local school and believed that education meant honoring both old wisdom and new possibilities. "She would have loved meeting you," Joe said, as stars began appearing in the darkening sky. She always said the best way to honor the past was to keep creating space for new stories. Sarah felt the weight of the compliment, the way it positioned her as someone worthy of Elena's hypothetical affection. "I don't have many good stories to tell." "Everyone has stories," Joe replied. "Some just take longer to find their shape." That night, alone in her small room, Sarah found herself thinking about stories, the one she had been living, the one she had fled, the one she might be beginning to write. For the first time in years, the future felt like a blank page rather than a predetermined sentence. 3 weeks into her stay, Sarah woke to find a small wrapped package on the table beside her bed. The cloth wrapping was traditional, undyed, cotton tied with a thin leather cord, and inside she found a bracelet unlike anything she had ever seen. The silver was clearly handcrafted, formed into delicate leaves that caught the morning light and threw it back in complex patterns. Set among the leaves were small turquoise stones, each one slightly different in shade and pattern, creating a piece that felt alive rather than manufactured. "Joe made it," Maria said from the doorway, having apparently been waiting for Sarah to discover the gift. "He's been working on it in the evenings." Sarah turned the bracelet in her hands, amazed by the craftsmanship and the obvious time it represented. "Why? Perhaps you should ask him." She found Joe in the workshop behind the main house, his hands busy with another piece of silver that was taking shape under his careful attention. The space smelled of metal and flux and the particular satisfaction that comes from creating something beautiful with one's hands. "Thank you," she said, holding up the bracelet. "It's incredible." Joe looked up from his work, and she saw something almost bashful in his expression. "I wanted you to have something that belonged to you, really belonged to you." The emphasis made her think of David's gifts, expensive jewelry that had always felt more like chains than ornaments, each piece carrying the weight of expectation and obligation. This bracelet felt different, lighter despite its substance, freely given rather than strategically deployed. "Would you help me put it on?" Joe set down his tools and moved to fasten the delicate clasp around her wrist. His fingers were warm against her skin, careful and sure, and Sarah found herself acutely aware of his proximity, the scent of silver and sage that seemed to cling to his clothes, the steadiness of his breathing, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead as he concentrated. "Perfect fit," he said, stepping back to admire his work. Sarah looked down at the bracelet, watching how it caught the light filtering through the workshop windows. The silver seemed to warm against her skin, becoming part of her in a way that felt both new and ancient. "Joe," she began, then stopped, unsure how to articulate what she was feeling. The bracelet was more than jewelry. It was acceptance, belonging, a statement that she was worth the investment of time and skill and precious materials. "You don't have to say anything," he said gently. "Just wear it if you want to." But Sarah found she did want to say something, needed to find words for the gratitude that was expanding in her chest like sunrise. "No one has ever made me anything before. Not like this." "Then they didn't know how to see you properly," Joe replied, and the simple statement carried the weight of recognition that made Sarah's throat tight with unexpected emotion. She looked around the workshop, noting the tools arranged with obvious care, the half-finished pieces that spoke of ongoing projects, the way everything had its place in a system that balanced creativity with order. "Will you teach me to work silver? To make something beautiful with my hands?" Joe studied her face for a moment, as if weighing something important. "It's not easy work. Takes patience. Takes time to develop the feel for it." "I have time," Sarah said, and realized it was true. For the first time in years, she had time that belonged entirely to her, time she could spend learning something for the pure joy of learning rather than to meet someone else's expectations. "Then yes," Joe said, his smile transforming his entire face. "I'll teach you." Learning to work silver required a different kind of patience than Sarah had ever cultivated. The metal demanded respect. Too much heat and it would burn, too little and it wouldn't respond to shaping. Joe's hands guided hers at first, showing her how to hold the tools, how to read the subtle changes in the silver's color that indicated temperature. "Feel the metal's willingness," he said, as Sarah struggled with a simple hammering exercise. "It wants to take shape, but only if you listen to what it's telling you." After several failed attempts, Sarah began to understand what he meant. The silver had its own language, spoken through resistance and compliance, through the way it responded to heat and pressure and patient coaxing. It was not unlike learning to trust again, a process that required sensitivity to subtle cues and the willingness to proceed slowly. As her skills developed, Sarah found herself spending more and more time in the workshop. There was something meditative about the work, the way it required complete presence and attention. Her mind, which had spent years racing between anxiety and hypervigilance, began to settle into quieter rhythms. Joe worked alongside her, creating his own pieces while remaining available for guidance and encouragement. Sarah learned to read his moods through the sound of his hammer against metal, quick, precise strikes when he was focused, slower, more thoughtful rhythms when he was working through something complex. "You're a natural," he said one afternoon, examining a leaf pendant Sarah had crafted under his guidance. "Look how you've captured the curve of the stem. That takes real observation." The praise warmed her in ways that had nothing to do with the workshop's heat. David's compliments had always felt conditional, delivered when she performed correctly, but withheld when she fell short of his expectations. Joe's appreciation seemed to spring from genuine recognition of her developing skill, offered freely, without the weight of judgment. As autumn deepened into winter, their working relationship evolved into something richer and more complex. Sometimes they worked in companionable silence, each absorbed in their own projects. Other times Joe would tell her stories, traditional tales that explained the symbolic meanings behind various designs, family stories that painted pictures of generations of craftspeople, personal memories that revealed more of who he was beneath his gentle exterior. "My grandfather taught me that silver remembers everything," he said one evening as they cleaned their tools. "Every hammer blow, every moment of heat, every hand that shapes it. That's why traditional jewelry carries such power. It holds the intentions of its maker." Sarah looked down at the bracelet he had made her, which she wore every day now. "What intention did you put into this?" Joe was quiet for a moment, his hand still on the cloth he was using to clean a piece of copper. "Safety," he said finally. "Belonging. The knowledge that you're valued exactly as you are." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning that went far beyond craftsmanship. Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that they had moved beyond teacher and student, beyond rescuer and rescued, into territory that was both thrilling and terrifying. "Joe," she said softly, and he looked up to meet her eyes. The moment stretched between them like silver wire being drawn fine, full of potential and fragility. Sarah saw her own uncertainty reflected in his expression, the same careful balance between hope and fear that she had been carrying since the day he found her in the desert. "I know," he said quietly, understanding the question she hadn't been able to ask. "I feel it too." The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late November, forwarded through a chain of postal redirections that David had somehow managed to trace. Sarah's name was written on the envelope in his careful penmanship, each letter precisely formed, as if he were still trying to control her even from a distance. Maria brought it to her where she sat in the workshop, and Sarah knew immediately what it was. Her hands began to shake before she even opened the envelope, muscle memory responding to a threat her mind hadn't fully processed yet. "Sarah, I know where you are. This has gone on long enough. I've been patient, understanding about your need for space, but people are starting to ask questions. Your behavior is reflecting poorly on both of us. I've enclosed a plane ticket. I expect you home by the weekend. We can work through this like adults. You know how much I love you. David." Enclosed with the letter was indeed a plane ticket from Albuquerque to Phoenix, dated for Friday, 3 days away. There was also a photograph, clearly taken with a telephoto lens, showing Sarah and Joe working together in the shop. The violation of it made her stomach clench with familiar fear. "He knows where I am," she whispered, the paper trembling in her hands. Joe appeared in the doorway, as if summoned by her distress, took one look at her face, and crossed the room, in quick strides. "What is it?" Sarah handed him the letter, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. She watched his expression change as he read, saw the careful control settle over his features like armor. "He can't make you go back," Joe said firmly. "This isn't a legal document, it's manipulation." "You don't understand," Sarah said, wrapping her arms around herself. "David doesn't make idle threats. If I don't go back voluntarily, he'll find another way. He has resources, connections. He always gets what he wants. Not this time. The certainty in Joe's voice made Sarah look up at him. His jaw was set in lines she hadn't seen before, and there was something in his eyes that reminded her that he was not just a gentle craftsman, but a man capable of protecting what mattered to him. "Sarah," he said, kneeling beside her chair so they were at eye level, "you're not the same person who ran into the desert. You're stronger now. We'll figure this out together." But even as he spoke, Sarah could feel the old fears reasserting themselves, the careful confidence she had built over the past months crumbling like walls built on sand. David's words echoed in her mind, "You know how much I love you," the phrase that had always preceded his most effective manipulations. "Maybe I should just go back," she said quietly. "Maybe this was all just delayed, inevitable. Maybe I was fooling myself thinking I could really start over." "Look at me," Joe said firmly, and when she met his eyes, she saw something that looked like barely controlled anger. "That man in the letter, he doesn't love you. Love doesn't threaten. Love doesn't stalk. Love doesn't try to make you smaller." Sarah nodded, understanding intellectually what he was saying, but the emotional programming ran deeper than logic. Fear was a language she spoke fluently, while courage was still a foreign tongue she was learning to pronounce. "I need some time to think," she said. Joe studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. "Whatever you decide, you won't face it alone." The promise should have been comforting, but as Sarah folded the letter with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, all she could think about was how David had found her once and would find her again, no matter where she tried to hide. That evening, the Yazzie family gathered in Maria's living room with a formality that spoke of serious business. Word had somehow spread about David's letter, and Sarah found herself surrounded by people who had claimed her as one of their own, despite knowing her for less than 2 months. Joe's uncle Robert, a man who worked for the tribal police, sat across from Sarah with a calm competence that reminded her of Joe himself. Janet, the woman from the festival who had become a friend, held a legal pad and pen as if prepared to take notes. Maria presided over the gathering with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being consulted on important matters. "Tell us about this man," Robert said gently. "What kind of person are we dealing with?" Sarah found herself describing David in ways she had never articulated before. His need for control disguised as care, his ability to make her doubt her own perceptions, the way he isolated her from friends and family while making it seem like natural consequence rather than deliberate strategy. "He's not violent," she said carefully. "Not physically, but he's persistent. And he has money, connections. He's used to getting what he wants." "Money doesn't mean much out here," Robert observed. "Connections either, depending on what kind of connections we're talking about." "He's a lawyer," Sarah said. "Corporate. He knows how to work systems, how to find pressure points." Janet looked up from her note-taking. "Is he your legal husband?" "Yes," Sarah said, the word feeling like ash in her mouth. "We never divorced. I just ran." "That complicates things," Robert admitted, "but it doesn't eliminate options." They talked for over an hour, exploring possibilities Sarah hadn't even considered. Restraining orders, which might or might not be enforceable across state lines. Legal separation proceedings that could be initiated from here. Resources for women in her situation that she hadn't known existed. But beneath the practical discussion, Sarah sensed something else happening. These people were circling around, her like wolves protecting a pack member, ready to defend her against threats they understood better than she did. The realization was both comforting and overwhelming. "Whatever we decide," Maria said as the formal discussion wound down, "Sarah needs to know she's not making this choice alone." "I can't ask you all to take risks for me," Sarah protested. "If David decides to make trouble, let him try," Joe said quietly, and there was steel in his voice that made several people nod agreement. After the others left, Sarah sat with Joe and Maria in the kitchen, drinking tea that tasted of chamomile and comfort. The silence felt contemplative rather than anxious, as if they were all processing the evening's revelations. "I keep thinking I should be braver," Sarah said finally. After everything you've all done for me, I should be ready to stand up to him." "Courage isn't the absence of fear," Maria replied. "It's acting rightly despite fear. You've already shown more courage than most people ever will." "Have I?" "You left," Joe said simply. "When staying would have been easier, when leaving meant risking everything, you chose yourself. That's the hardest kind of courage there is." Sarah thought about that night in the desert, the moment when she had decided to walk away from everything, familiar rather than endure one more day of systematic diminishment. It hadn't felt courageous at the time, more like desperation, like the last resort of someone who had run out of alternatives. But perhaps courage was like silversmithing, a skill that looked impossible from the outside, but revealed itself to be a series of small, manageable steps once you understood the process. "What if I stayed?" she asked quietly. "What if I just didn't go back?" "Then you'd stay," Joe said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "We'd figure out the rest as it comes." Friday morning arrived grey and cold, with clouds building over the mountains that promised the season's first snow. Sarah stood at her bedroom window, watching the desert prepare for winter, and thought about the plane ticket that lay unused on her dresser. She had made her decision sometime during the long hours of darkness, not through dramatic revelation, but through the gradual accumulation of certainty. She would not be returning to Phoenix. She would not be resuming her role as David's wife. Whatever consequences followed, she would face them here, surrounded by people who had proven that love could exist without conditions. Joe appeared in her doorway with coffee, and the careful expression of someone trying not to influence a decision that wasn't his to make. "I'm not going," she said simply. Relief flickered across his features so quickly she almost missed it. "Are you sure?" "As sure as I can be about anything." He set down the coffee and moved to stand beside her at the window. "It won't be easy. He'll probably escalate before he gives up." "I know." Sarah turned the silver bracelet on her wrist, feeling its familiar weight. "But I also know I can't go back to being who I was. That person is gone." "Good," Joe said firmly. She deserved better than what she got. They were interrupted by the sound of a car engine, unusual enough in this remote location to be noteworthy. Through the window, Sarah saw a black sedan making its way up the dirt road that led to the Yazzie compound, expensive and out of place among the pickup trucks and older vehicles that belonged here. "He came," she whispered, recognizing the inevitable even before the car stopped, and David emerged from the driver's side. He looked exactly as she remembered, tall, well-dressed, carrying himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to having his expectations met. But seeing him here in this place that had become sanctuary, Sarah felt something she hadn't expected. Not terror, but anger. "Stay here," Joe said, but Sarah shook her head. "No, this is mine to handle." She walked outside to meet David in the central area of the compound, aware that doors were opening around them, that the Yazzie family was emerging to witness this confrontation. Not to interfere, but to bear witness, to ensure that whatever happened next would not happen in isolation. "Sarah," David said, his voice carrying the particular tone he used when he was exercising patience with her unreasonable behavior. "You look different." She supposed she did. Months of desert sun had changed her coloring, physical work had changed her posture, and something deeper had changed the way she moved through the world. She was no longer trying to make herself smaller. "I got your letter," she said. Then, "You know it's time to come home. This has gone on long enough. This is my home now." David's expression flickered with something that might have been genuine surprise. "Don't be ridiculous. You can't seriously intend to stay here. Look around. You, Sarah, this isn't your world. Here it's more my world than Phoenix ever was. You're being dramatic. We can work through whatever issues you think we have, but running away isn't the solution." Sarah felt Joe move to stand slightly behind her and to the right, close enough to offer support, but far enough to make clear this was her conversation to lead. The gesture gave her strength. "I'm not running away anymore," she said clearly. "I'm choosing to stay somewhere I'm valued for who I am, rather than who you want me to be." David's face hardened, the patient mask slipping to reveal the control. That had always lurked beneath. "You're my wife. We took vows." Vows you broke long before I left. I never cheated. There are other ways to break faith, Sarah interrupted, surprising herself with her steadiness. You made me disappear, piece by piece, until there was almost nothing left. That's not love, David, that's possession. The confrontation continued for several more minutes, David alternating between threats and manipulation, promises and ultimatums. But Sarah found that the words that had once held such power over her now seemed to bounce off like rain on stone. She had learned to trust her own perceptions again, and from this new vantage point David's arguments revealed themselves as the self-serving constructs they had always been. You'll regret this, he said finally, when it became clear that neither charm nor intimidation was going to work. These people you think care about you. They're just being polite. You're not one of them. You never will be. Maybe not, Sarah agreed, but I'd rather be honestly myself among people who respect that than live as someone else's idea of who I should be. David got back in his car and drove away without another word, leaving Sarah standing in the place she had chosen to claim as home, surrounded by people who had chosen to claim her as family. Spring came to the desert like a whispered secret, painting the austere landscape with wildflowers that bloomed in impossible colors. Sarah stood in the workshop that had become as much hers as Joe's, putting finishing touches on a silver necklace. That would be her contribution to the upcoming spring celebration. The piece had taken her months to complete, not because of technical difficulty, but because she had wanted every element to tell the story accurately. The central pendant was shaped like a leaf emerging from a spiral, representing growth from the center of oneself. Smaller charms hung at intervals around the chain, a tiny horse for the journey that had brought her here, a desert flower for the beauty that could bloom in harsh places, a mountain for the strength she had discovered in herself. It's beautiful, Joe said, looking over her shoulder at the completed piece. Elena would have loved the craftsmanship. Sarah had grown comfortable with his mentions of Elena, understanding now that love didn't diminish by being shared, but expanded to encompass new possibilities. I hope she would have approved of me wearing her dress to the festival tonight. More than approved, Joe said softly. She would have been glad to know it was worn by someone who understood its value. The divorce papers had been finalized 3 weeks earlier, processed through a legal aid attorney who specialized in helping women escape difficult marriages. David had contested nothing, apparently preferring to maintain the fiction that he had been the one to end things, rather than admitting his wife had chosen freedom over his particular version of security. Sarah was officially, legally, completely, herself again for the first time in years. That evening, wearing Elena's turquoise dress and her own silver necklace, Sarah joined the spring celebration with a heart that felt lighter than desert air. She danced with Joe under a sky full of stars, moved through conversations in both English and the Navajo phrases she was slowly learning, and laughed with children who had claimed her as their adoptive aunt. During a quiet moment between dances, Joe led her away from the crowd to a small hill that overlooked the compound. The music drifted up to them on warm air, mixing with the sound of night birds and distant coyotes. I have something for you, Joe said, producing a small wrapped package from his pocket. Inside was a ring, not a wedding band, but something uniquely his creation. Silver formed into a flowing pattern that reminded Sarah of water finding its way through stone, set with a small turquoise that seemed to hold captured sky. It's not what you think, he said quickly, seeing her expression. I mean, it could be someday if you wanted, but mostly it's just a promise. What kind of promise? Joe took her hand, looking down at the silver bracelet he had made for her months earlier. That you'll always have a place here, that you're valued exactly as you are, that love doesn't have to make you smaller. Sarah thought about all the distance she had traveled, not just the physical miles from Phoenix to this remote desert compound, but the internal journey from fear to trust, from hiding to belonging, from survival to genuine joy. Yes, she said, and the word felt like silver being shaped by patient hands into something beautiful and lasting. Joe slipped the ring onto her right hand, and Sarah admired how it looked next to the bracelet, how the pieces worked together to create something greater than the sum of their parts, like family, like love. like the new story she was still learning to tell. Below them, the celebration continued into the night, and above them, the stars wheeled in their eternal patterns. Sarah leaned against Joe's warmth and felt the deep satisfaction that comes from finally being exactly where and who you're meant to be. The desert had taken everything she thought she wanted and given her everything she actually needed. It had stripped away illusions and replaced them with truth, shown her that courage was not the absence of fear, but the presence of something worth protecting. In the distance, a coyote called to its pack, and the sound was answered from multiple directions, a conversation in the language of belonging that Sarah finally understood.